Lemuria. For more than a century, Lemuria has been treated as a fringe myth, an imaginary land invented to explain a zoological puzzle. But that story was never true. Lemuria began as a scientific discovery, not folklore. And the earliest researchers who proposed it were not mystics, they were some of the most respected geologists and biologists of their time. In the mid-1800s, British and French scientists studying Madagascar made an alarming observation. The island's species were far too old, far too isolated, and far too genetically distinct to have arrived by chance. The same strange lineage appeared in India and parts of East Africa, forming a biological bridge that could only make sense if an entire continent once connected them. When deep-sea expeditions later mapped the Indian Ocean floor, they found massive plateaus, drowned mountain ranges, and stepped escarpments stretching thousands of kilometers, the unmistakable shape of a vanished landmass. But the moment these findings began questioning colonial narratives about who lived where and how advanced ancient peoples might have been, the story took a darker turn. Early drafts of geological reports, now almost impossible to locate, described exposed ridges that formed coastlines roughly 50,000 years ago. Researchers claimed that before rising seas consumed the region, Lemuria may have supported dense forests, fertile plains, and human settlements long before the Indus Valley or Sumer. One leaked account mentioned tool fragments lifted from dredging nets between Mauritius and the Seychelles, fragments that disappeared after being relocated for institutional review. By the early 1900s, major colonial powers declared the Lemuria hypothesis unscientific, even though they continued funding quiet oceanographic surveys of the same region for decades. What those surveys found was never shared with the public. The final blow came during the World Wars, when control of the Indian Ocean meant control of global supply routes. Maps of submerged continental shelves were classified under military secrecy, and any suggestion of lost civilizations in that region was labeled pseudoscience. Lemuria didn't vanish from scientific literature because it was disproven. It vanished because it raised questions about ancient maritime cultures, pre-Vedic migrations, and technologies that predated every accepted timeline. What humanity lost was not just a continent, but the story of an entire chapter of our species, one that was quietly sealed beneath the ocean and erased from history the moment it challenged the powers who wrote it. Sundaland. Sundaland was not a small island chain. It was a vast Ice Age continent larger than modern India that connected Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Philippines into a single continuous landmass. For tens of thousands of years, it was one of the most habitable regions on Earth, warm, fertile, river-rich, and protected by natural mountain walls. And yet the moment researchers realized how advanced the people of Sundaland might have been, the narrative around it shifted from curiosity to silence. What began as a simple geological discovery slowly transformed into one of the most quietly suppressed chapters of human prehistory. When sea levels were 120 meters lower during the last ice age, Sundaland wasn't underwater, it was the center of Southeast Asian civilization. Archaeologists in the 1930 seconds uncovered evidence of stone structures and ancient habitation floors on what are now submerged shelf edges. But almost every major site was buried again or placed under government control during the colonial era. The official explanation was always the same: inconclusive, premature, or requiring further review. Privately, several researchers admitted that the artifacts were too advanced, too old, and too widespread to fit the timelines imposed by Western academia. One diver reported grid pattern foundations near the Sunda Shelf, only to have his notes confiscated by naval authorities. After World War II, the silence deepened. As underwater oil and gas reserves were discovered in the region, entire geological surveys, hundreds of pages long, were reclassified for national security. Independent researchers who attempted to map the drowned rivers and valleys of Sundaland consistently ran into the same obstacle: restricted maritime zones, no-dive orders, or sudden cancellation of permits. The deeper they explored, the clearer the pattern became. Sundaland's coastline was dotted with ancient settlements long before Mesopotamia existed. Its people likely mastered early navigation, agriculture, and metallurgy developments that would shift the origin of complex societies away from the Middle East and toward Southeast Asia. But that shift threatened too many established historical models, academic institutions, and geopolitical narratives. The easiest solution was to bury the evidence literally under the rising ocean and figuratively under bureaucratic control. As Sundaland drowned at the end of the Ice Age, an entire civilization was erased. And when modern scientists tried to recover its memory, powerful interests made sure the world would never learn just how advanced those ancient cultures truly were. What humanity lost was not only land, but a forgotten birthplace of civilization itself. Zealandia. Zealandia is the most extraordinary geological discovery of the 21st century, yet almost no one knows its full story. This is not an island, not a region, not a myth. It is a literal continent, a 4.9 million square kilometer landmass hiding beneath the waves of the South Pacific. 94% of it lies underwater, but the remaining 6% is what we now call New Zealand. When geologists first proposed Zealandia in the 1990s, their research should have rewritten the entire world map. Instead, it was quietly sidelined, questioned, minimized, and buried under administrative review, because the truth was far more disruptive than anyone expected. Early expeditions found continental crust where none should exist: granites, metamorphic rocks, and fossil-bearing sediments indicating a massive landmass once stood above sea level. Then came the drilling samples: pollen, plant remnants, and shallow water fossils, showing that Zealandia wasn't always submerged. It was once a thriving continent with forests, lakes, and ecosystems stretching across an area nearly 2/3 the size of Australia. But the implications didn't stop at geology. Once researchers confirmed its size, age, and composition, they stumbled into something far more sensitive: prehistoric life and migration patterns that contradicted every accepted model of human origin. Several samples suggested organisms that should not have been geographically separated unless humans or something capable of long-distance movement had been present far earlier than mainstream timelines allow. That was when the resistance began. Research funding dried up. Several drilling results quietly vanished from university archives. International committees delayed the recognition of Zealandia, not for scientific reasons, but for political and economic ones. Acknowledging a new continent meant reopening territorial rights across the Pacific mineral deposits, rare earth reserves, deep ocean drilling zones, and exclusive economic boundaries worth trillions. Nations with vested interests had no intention of renegotiating their claims, and so the continent remained an academic curiosity rather than a global revelation. One of the most troubling events occurred during a joint research mission in the mid-2000s. A team reported unexpected man-made geometric patterns captured on sub-sea floor imaging rectilinear formations buried under layers of sediment. Within days, the report was sealed, the equipment seized, and the team reassigned under new contracts that forbade public disclosure. The official explanation was data misinterpretation, but insiders admitted the images were too precise to ignore. Zealandia was not suppressed because it was unbelievable. It was suppressed because it was undeniable. A lost eighth continent lying beneath the Pacific forced the world to confront a possibility institutions were not prepared for: that humanity's story is older, wider, and far more complex than the current timeline permits. And in burying Zealandia, we lost more than a continent. We lost a chapter of human history that might have reshaped everything we think we know about our past. Beringia. Beringia was far more than a land bridge. It was a continent-sized world stretching more than 1,000 miles from Siberia to Alaska, covered with grasslands, rivers, forests, and thriving ecosystems. For tens of thousands of years, it was one of the most stable, livable regions on Earth. Yet, despite its enormous size and its role as a human homeland, Beringia remains one of the most aggressively downplayed chapters in global prehistory. The reason is simple. The moment archaeologists uncovered evidence of civilizations older than any officially accepted timeline, governments intervened, military agencies claimed jurisdiction, and entire research programs were quietly shut down. In the early 20th century, Russian and American expeditions discovered stratified cultural layers beneath the permafrost stone blades, fire pits, bone tools, and engraved objects predating the Clovis culture by tens of thousands of years. These artifacts suggested something unthinkable at the time. Humans lived in Beringia long before the accepted migration events, long before the official peopling of the Americas. But rather than revising the timeline, authorities sealed the sites. During the Cold War, Beringia became a strategic military zone. Research permits were revoked, dig sites fenced off, and archaeologists were told their findings were anomalies that required reanalysis. Most of those artifacts never reappeared. The most troubling suppression occurred in the 1970s when a joint Soviet-US scientific collaboration retrieved deep soil samples from what had once been the Beringian coastline. The samples contained charcoal layers and biological residues consistent with sustained human habitation permanent settlements, not nomadic groups. Shortly afterward, the collaboration dissolved, the records disappeared, and multiple scientists involved reported that they were pressured to sign non-disclosure agreements under national security classifications. Public explanations claimed methodological errors, but private notes from one researcher hinted at something far more significant: evidence of symbolic objects and structural remnants buried beneath layers of frozen sediment. What made Beringia dangerous was not just its age. It challenged the foundational story of the Americas, its timelines, its migrations, and most importantly, its ownership narratives. Acknowledging a sophisticated Ice Age culture occupying a now submerged landmass would have forced institutions to rewrite textbooks, redraw ancient maps, and acknowledge civilizations that predated the oldest known societies by millennia. And so the safest solution was to erase Beringia geologically real, historically rich, yet politically inconvenient. The continent melted, the evidence vanished into restricted archives, and humanity lost a crucial key to understanding its deepest origins. What lies beneath the Bering Sea is not just a forgotten land, but an entire civilization's memory buried under ice, water, and silence. Doggerland. Doggerland was once the heart of Europe, a vast green continent stretching from modern Britain to Denmark, filled with rivers, forests, lakes, and entire communities that thrived for thousands of years. It wasn't a scattered set of islands, it was a fully developed landscape, larger than many modern countries, and it served as the cultural and economic center of Northern Europe during the last Ice Age. But the moment post-war researchers realized how advanced its inhabitants might have been, Doggerland shifted from a geological curiosity to a classified subject. What should have been Europe's most important archaeological discovery became one of its quietest disappearances. The first real evidence emerged in the early 20th century when fishing trawlers began pulling ancient bones, stone tools, and carved antler objects from the seabed. These were not crude scraps, they were crafted with precision, decorated with symbols, and in some cases shaped into tools far more advanced than what mainstream archaeology expected from that era. When divers discovered submerged peat layers containing remnants of dwellings, hearths, and work timber, the implications became impossible to ignore. Doggerland wasn't just inhabited, it was civilized. Yet almost immediately, corporate and governmental obstacles began to rise. After World War II, the North Sea became one of the most strategically important regions on Earth due to its oil and gas reserves. Geological surveys mapping the seabed uncovered rectilinear anomalies, straight lines, square foundations, and large-scale structural remnants. But every one of these reports was classified under the guise of resource security. Companies with drilling rights quietly purchased archaeological data to keep it out of public reach, fearing that cultural heritage claims could halt billion-dollar extraction projects. Even today, portions of the North Sea are off-limits to independent researchers, despite having no military operations or ecological protections. The reason given is always logistical safety. The real reason is far more revealing. In the 1990s, a now-silenced team from a European university used side-scan sonar to map what they described as a drowned settlement grid. a pattern of straight channels and rectangular spaces consistent with organized human habitation. Their findings leaked briefly before disappearing from public archives. Funding vanished. Equipment was reassigned. The researchers were told that further exploration risked interfering with commercial pipelines. Doggerland didn't vanish from memory because the ocean swallowed it. It vanished because acknowledging a prehistoric European civilization organized, stable, and technologically capable would rewrite everything about Europe's past. It challenges national histories, cultural identities, and the long-held narrative that civilization originated in the Mediterranean and spread outward. What humanity lost in Doggerland was not only a continent, but an origin story, one that once connected an entire region before politics, profit, and power decided it was better left underwater. Greater Adria. Greater Adria is one of the most extraordinary geological revelations of the modern age, a literal lost continent, the size of Greenland that once stretched across what is now Italy, Greece, and the Balkans. For decades, it was dismissed as an odd collection of mountain fragments and mismatched rock layers. But early 20th century geologists already suspected the truth. These layers did not belong to Europe. They belonged to a vanished landmass that had been crushed, folded, and buried beneath the continent. When researchers first pieced together its outline, the discovery should have rewritten the entire prehistoric map of Europe. Instead, it triggered a chain of quiet interventions, retractions, and academic disappearances that turned Greater Adria into one of the most carefully muted stories in geology. What made Greater Adria dangerous was not just its existence, it was its age and what had been found within the fragments. Beneath the Alps and parts of southern Europe lie rock units filled with fossils, sediments, and mineral signatures that do not match the known geological history of the region. Some strata indicated long periods of stability, fertile plains, and shallow seas, conditions ideal for early human cultures. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a few researchers reported strange carvings and tool-like fragments embedded in uplifted limestone, suggesting a prehistoric people had once lived on this lost continent. Their reports were promptly corrected or dismissed as contamination, and the artifacts themselves vanished into private or institutional collections. The pattern intensified after World War II, when Europe's borders and national identities were being redefined. Several nations quietly suppressed geological maps of the region because confirming the extent of Greater Adria would complicate legal claims over subsurface resources, mineral rights, and territorial boundaries. Oil and gas corporations lobbied against public acknowledgement of the continent, fearing prehistoric cultural layers might create heritage protection zones that could halt extraction operations. Even university-led research faced sudden funding cuts the moment findings pointed toward ancient settlement patterns rather than pure geology. One of the most troubling incidents occurred in the 1970 seconds, when a research team studying tectonic uplift in the Apennines reported non-natural geometric voids. Inside deep limestone folds, rectangular cavities filled with debris inconsistent with natural cave formation. Their follow-up investigations were blocked by government agencies, citing structural risk assessments, and their preliminary papers were withdrawn before publication. Privately, a member of the team admitted that they had found something that could not be explained by geology alone. Greater Adria was not erased because it was unimportant. It was erased because it implied a forgotten civilization crushed literally beneath modern Europe. Acknowledging it would rewrite the continent's prehistory, challenge long-established cultural narratives, and expose how much of our past has been hidden beneath layers of stone, secrecy, and silence. What humanity lost was not only a continent, but the memory of a people who lived, built, and disappeared long before Europe ever knew their name. Kumari Kandam. Kumari Kandam is one of the most fiercely contested lost continents on Earth, not because there is no evidence for it, but because the evidence points toward an ancient civilization so advanced, so old, and so disruptive to accepted history that acknowledging it would rewrite the origins of South Asian culture. For centuries, Tamil literature described a vast land, stretching far south of modern India, a place of kings, scholars, maritime traders, and cities that thrived long before the earliest known empires. These ancient texts were dismissed as poetic exaggeration until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when British and Indian scholars quietly discovered geological and archaeological clues suggesting the legend had a real foundation. That was the moment Kumari Kandam shifted from myth to threat. Early bathymetric maps of the Indian Ocean revealed submerged plateaus, drowned river systems, and continental fragments extending deep beneath the waves south of Tamil Nadu. Several colonial-era researchers recorded stone blocks, scorched pottery, and man-made structures recovered from dredging expeditions near the Laccadive Ridge and the Sri Lanka Shelf. These findings were initially included in academic drafts, but were later removed from published reports. Scholars involved admitted, off the record, that the artifacts were too advanced for their assigned age. The implication that a sophisticated culture existed in the Deep South before the Indus Valley challenged both colonial narratives and European interpretations of Indian history. After India gained independence, new surveys using sonar and seismic imaging revealed even more unsettling discoveries. Rectilinear formations, ancient riverbeds, and silted-over basin structures consistent with urban planning. But because these underwater regions fell under politically sensitive maritime borders, most findings were classified for territorial security. When independent divers attempted to explore deeper areas in the 1992s and early 2000s, several expeditions were abruptly halted by Coast Guard intervention. The official reason was always safety. The unofficial truth was far more revealing. Underwater ruins could provoke cultural and political shifts, granting Tamil civilization a level of antiquity and technological prestige that would force academia to rewrite the global timeline of early human development. One of the most troubling cases involved a 2003 oceanographic survey that photographed stone alignments, arranged in perfect parallel rows, something nature does not create. Within days, the images disappeared from public archives, and the lead researcher resigned without explanation. Locals whispered that the formation resembled an ancient harbor, a remnant of the seafaring culture described in Sangam texts. Kumari Kandam was not erased because it was fantasy. It was erased because it was real. It threatened established historical models, colonial-era narratives, and geopolitical claims. The lost southern continent represented a civilization that may have mastered navigation, astronomy, and urban planning long before recorded history even began. What humanity lost beneath the Indian Ocean was not just land, it was a cradle of knowledge, innovation, and identity, sealed beneath the waves to protect the version of history approved for the world. Sahul. Sahul was once one of the great supercontinents of the ancient world, a vast connected landmass uniting Australia, Tasmania, and Papua New Guinea into a single continuous continent stretching thousands of miles. During the last ice age, it was not a scattered chain of islands, but a colossal expanse of fertile plains, river networks, and open grasslands. And for tens of thousands of years, it was home to some of the earliest, most resilient, and most technologically capable humans to ever walk the earth. Yet the deeper researchers dug into Sahul's prehistory, the more aggressively the narrative around it was controlled. What should have been celebrated as one of humanity's oldest cradles was instead quietly contained, minimized, and shielded from public understanding. The first cracks in the mainstream story appeared when archaeologists in the mid-20th century unearthed tools in Australia more than 40,000 years old, then 50,000, then over 65,000. These discoveries alone were enough to cause discomfort in academia because they pushed human migration far earlier than accepted timelines. But what happened next was even more disruptive. Underwater surveys along the now submerged continental shelf revealed drowned ridgelines that resembled ancient coastlines, and in some places, sonar imaging detected geometric anomalies, straight arrangements of stones, circular depressions, and layered platforms buried beneath silt. These reports were quietly archived, then restricted, and in several cases removed entirely from public access. The official justification was insufficient verification. Off the record, researchers admitted the real problem. The finds implied organized settlement, long-distance navigation, and even early construction techniques tens of thousands of years before they were supposed to exist. As oil and gas corporations expanded offshore drilling in northern Australia, their geological scans repeatedly detected unusual features along the submerged Sahul shelf features that could have been prehistoric canals or irrigation systems. Rather than investigating, authorities classified the scans as proprietary data. Cultural heritage investigators later revealed they were denied access to these maps, even when the regions had no commercial activity. The concern was clear. If underwater ruins were confirmed, national governments would face massive legal claims from indigenous communities whose ancestral lands extended far beyond modern shorelines. The political and economic risks were enormous. One of the most unsettling episodes occurred in the 1,980 seconds, when divers near the Arafura Sea filmed what appeared to be stone alignments, forming a semicircular pattern reminiscent of an ancient gathering site. The footage was confiscated by maritime authorities days after being submitted for analysis. The divers were told the formation was a natural coincidence. Yet, internal memos later revealed concerns that publicizing it would fuel debates about ancient maritime technology debates mainstream institutions were not prepared to confront. Sahul was not sidelined because it lacked evidence. It was sidelined because it held too much. It challenged the idea that early humans were primitive, isolated wanderers. It suggested they built communities, traveled vast distances by sea, and adapted to rising waters with ingenuity we still don't fully understand. What humanity lost when Sahul drowned was not merely a continent, it was proof that our species' intelligence, creativity, and complexity began far earlier than the official story allows. And what we lost through suppression was the chance to finally understand the true age and sophistication of the first people who called this continent home. Mauritia. Mauritia is one of the most unsettling lost continents ever discovered, not because of its size, but because of its age. Beneath the blue waters, around Mauritius and Réunion, lies a fragment of continental crust older than India, older than Madagascar, and in some places older than any landmass in the Indian Ocean. When researchers first identified traces of Mauritia in the early 2010 seconds, the scientific world reacted with curiosity. But the tone changed instantly when the deeper implications surfaced. Mauritia was not a volcanic island chain. It was the shattered remnant of a primordial continent that vanished tens of millions of years ago, and the samples pulled from its depths revealed anomalies that institutions could not easily explain or comfortably allow into public awareness. The first clue came in the form of ancient zircon crystals, billions of years old, found inside lava flows on Mauritius. These crystals could not have formed on a volcanic island. They belonged to continental crust, meaning a lost land had once existed there. But then researchers discovered something even more disturbing. Sections of the submerged plateau contained sediment layers consistent with shallow coastlines, river systems, and possibly long stable environments. In other words, Mauritia was not just a geological accident. It was a habitable continent, and once that was known, the suppression began. Oil and gas companies quickly recognized the significance. Continental crust meant potential deep resource deposits, minerals, rare earths, and hydrocarbons worth billions. Immediately, several universities conducting research in the region were pressured by corporate partners to restrict access to seismic imaging data. A number of independent geological reports were pulled from public archives, replaced with watered-down summaries that omitted the most controversial findings: rectilinear seabed features, anomalous sediment structures, and magnetic signatures suggesting ancient habitation zones. Researchers who tried to publish more detailed analyses found their work delayed, reassigned, or quietly declined by journals claiming the data was inconclusive. One of the most troubling incidents surfaced in 2017 when a private research vessel captured high-resolution sonar images off the Mascarene Plateau, showing parallel ridges and grid-like depressions inconsistent with volcanic activity. The images circulated briefly among academics before being seized under a maritime confidentiality order. The vessel's crew later stated that they were warned not to speculate about archaeological interpretations. Months later, the lead scientist resigned from her institution without reason. Mauritia was not buried because it was insignificant. It was buried because it hinted at a forgotten world, a place where ancient coastlines once cradled ecosystems and possibly early human or proto-human activity far older than mainstream timelines permit. Recognizing Mauritia would force scientists to re-examine migration theories, ocean-level histories, and the existence of civilizations predating known cultures. What humanity lost beneath Mauritia wasn't just a landmass, it was a missing chapter in our species' deep time story, one that powerful institutions decided the world was not meant to read. The Antarctic Ring. The Antarctic Ring is the most aggressively hidden landmass on Earth, not because it lies beneath miles of ice, but because for most of human history, it didn't. Before the last great glacial shift, Antarctica was not a frozen wasteland. It was a warm, habitable continent with lakes, forests, and shorelines mapped by civilizations we no longer remember. The true shock came in the mid-20th century, when military expeditions, secret surveys, and classified drilling programs uncovered evidence of something that should have rewritten global history. Structures, anomalies, and remnants suggesting human presence long before the ice arrived. From that moment forward, the Antarctic Ring became a geopolitical secret, protected, restricted, and sealed away from the public under the thinnest veil of scientific research. The first modern clue appeared in the 1940 seconds, when U.S. and European naval missions captured radar returns showing smooth, geometric shapes beneath the ice shapes too precise to be natural. These findings were never released. Instead, the missions were reported as routine cold weather trials. But surviving notes from one officer described a ring-shaped valley with symmetrical walls and a central plateau, an impossibility in a landscape supposedly untouched by humans. Within a decade, several governments imposed permanent no-fly zones over specific coordinates, citing safety concerns despite the absence of any real hazards. Then came the drilling anomalies. Sensors recorded temperature spikes, hollow zones, and layers that looked less like ancient ice and more like compacted Earth, evidence that the ice sheet had buried entire surface features intact. A few cores even contained pollen, diatoms, and organic sediments from warm climate ecosystems. These discoveries, instead of being celebrated, were quietly classified. The researchers who insisted on publishing full findings found their access revoked, their funding cut, or their data confiscated for verification. The most explosive incident occurred during a Cold War reconnaissance program. Satellite imagery revealed an enormous circular depression tens of miles wide, with straight-line features radiating from its center. The pattern was unmistakably artificial. Within weeks, those images were restricted under military secrecy codes. When a leaked version reached civilian scientists, the explanation was immediate and absolute: glacial artifact. But one researcher's private handwritten note, discovered years later, told a different story. This is not ice. What frightened institutions was not just the possibility of structures, it was what they implied. A habitable Antarctica meant earlier civilizations than any recognized timeline allows. It meant seafaring cultures existed long before recorded history. It meant our understanding of climate cycles, human migration, and ancient technology was deeply incomplete, and someone wanted it to stay that way. By sealing Antarctica under treaties that forbid independent exploration, drilling, or settlement, the world's most powerful nations ensured that whatever lies beneath the ice remains buried. The Antarctic Ring wasn't hidden because it was unimportant. It was hidden because it was definitive proof that history is older, more complex, and more unsettling than the narrative we are taught. Beneath the frozen miles of the southern continent lies an entire chapter of human civilization that we were never meant to uncover.